Two things before we start today's show. First, thank you to everyone who commented on the Indiegogo for Victorian Mage that they wanted me to write an Umbra section. So I have a 7,500 word supplement on the Victorian Umbra to write, and I will keep you posted as that happens. Second, the Old World of Darkness Network is running a virtual convention the weekend of May 14th and 15th, 2021 online, and we are calling it TryItCon. I'm helping with this, as are a number of other Old World of Darkness podcast havers. And if you would like to see a particular game run or would like to help run a particular game, we're doing a survey now to find out what we should and can offer. Links to that are available in the show notes. Thank you if you give us your opinion if you plan on participating. If you're just curious about what games will be available, that'll be out after April 19th. More information is available at tryitcon.com. And with that, on with the show. Hi, Mage fans. This is your host, Terry Robinson, and on today's episode of Mage the Podcast, we are doing a Mage Basics episode, which may or may not be part of a series by the time this comes out, with co-host and friend of the show, Josh Heath of Werewolf the Podcast and Mage the Podcast. Josh, how you doing?
Hi, everybody. I'm doing great. I'm super excited to be talking to Terry because I always have fun when we are talking to one another. And this topic is at least interesting, so I'll see if I enjoy it.
We're going to put the E in Seekings. I should have gotten into marketing. So we're gonna talk about Seeking. So the first question is what is a Seeking? And one of the mistakes I've made being a Mage fan is using the power of the look through my library on Drive-Thru RPG, which is a feature where you can go to your library tab, and it's been listed as beta for the last 2 years. And you can look for all instances of a word or phrase. And that is usually when someone's like, does anyone have any Ethership names? I'm like, aha, I will look through all of them. When you do that for my library, I think every Mage book comes up. So that was a bad way of starting. So I looked through all the core rulebooks, and I was surprised to find how much the definition of seeking has changed over the editions. And it's not just one of those things where in first edition, a seeking was you drop acid with your avatar and then you punch God or something like that. But it is something that has moved considerably between them. But kind of as a starting point, mechanically, a seeking is the way in which a character increases their arete. You get a dot. You spend some XP, you do a thing, and hopefully your arete increases out the other side. Narratively, it is some sort of event. It usually involves the avatar, and there's some sort of metaphysical change. But as you will see shortly, the definition of what actually a seeking consists of has changed wildly across editions.
There doesn't seem to be a lot of consistency and that's not necessarily a bad thing. I think they just fit the themes of the different editions.
Yeah.
For different purposes.
Yeah, I found it super useful because one of those things that I thought I had invented, nope, first edition, it's literally been out for 28 years or something like that. I've done that a few times.
I'm always amused when people are like, I've come up with this great idea for the World of Darkness. And I'm like, yeah, that was in blah, blah, blah book back in 1994.
Mummy first edition. Seekings in first edition were important because Ascension and the Ascension conflict were front and center. In the same way that a Wraith will seek Transcendence, a Mage would seek Ascension. Everyone had their little Mage sight set, tuned in towards Ascension, and when you got 10 Arete, you won Mage. And that kind of clear-cut goal, I think, is something that World of Darkness could use in some cases. This, single-minded determination to increase your Arete also helped explain why in first edition you'd be like, this low-power mage merely has 75 dots in the spheres and an arete of 7. And you're like, that can level a city. Once your character had enough experience, total, their avatar would poke at them, and after a moment of significance would give them some sort of quest or goal. This moment where your avatar was like, you need to go start a newspaper, or something like that, was called an epiphany. They were generally tied to the essences and required doing something in the world around you. They were entirely exterior, or almost always exterior. Your avatar was like, go fix this paradox realm, or go kill this guy. It wasn't like, you have to go on an inner journey. Mages seem to have an ability to know when someone else was kind of on an avatar quest, and everyone was kind of respectful of that. in a way, which I think is kind of interesting, especially if they mean that in like the broadest possible term, that you could have this Nefandus going for dark ascension, everyone be like, hey, he needs the me time right now. Just let him, just let Baloth the Undying finish skinning the seventh person, and then we can get back to our fight to control reality.
Makes me wonder if the traditions and the technocracy also kind of respected that. You're like out in the void, and the technocrats are like, whoa, don't shoot at that one. He's on a seeking.
Yeah.
We can't attack him right now.
Once the seeking is done, then we can blow up the person who requires no breathing apparatus in the deep umbra with like our quantum torpedoes or something like that. But for now, it's all about him. It's like beating up someone on their birthday. You just wait 24 hours.
Exactly. Not the time for it.
The one exception to this was primordial characters would generally have to face inner demons, although I wouldn't be surprised if there was some reference in the 1E core rulebook that mages were literally composed of demons or something like that, at which point it was no longer a metaphor. Pattern characters would need to reinforce the connections between them and the elements of the cosmos. Dynamic characters would have to go make some change in the world around them. You could encounter personal flaws, but they were either exemplified by the quest you were asked to do, or your avatar would cause seemingly the embodiment of these things to come up. So instead of facing a inner metaphor, your inner attributes would be made manifest in the world somehow, and you would need to deal with them. Maybe your avatar felt that you were slothful, so your progress would be impeded by maybe a government official that was slow to approve things, or the police would be slow to respond, or something like that. And the entities that responded may or may not actually exist outside of this seeking. Once your Arete increased, once you passed, and this could take anywhere from hours to years and could be woven into a story, you would spend the XP and your Arete would increase. And that was the 1E version of a seeking.
It reminds me, the seeking stuff that you just mentioned reminds me of harrowings and Wraith.
Mm-hmm.
Different focus, but the same kind of like establishment of a system. Like you go in a harrowing, when your corpus or your body as a Wraith is destroyed, you go into the underworld and are faced with things that are both negative and potentially positive about your life. It's kind of like this is your life moment that you go through. So I see some similarities that they were thinking between seekings and that.
Oh yeah, and mages can undergo harrowings. If you are killed while in the underworld, you go through what they refer to as a harrowing or an anti-seeking, where if you fail, you lose a dot of Arete, which I don't know about you, seems like it'd be a real kick in the junk.
Yeah, I don't think I've never liked negative levels in D&D. I would not be the person that would take away Arete from someone. This would not happen.
Yeah. So what were seekings like in 2E, Josh?
So in second edition, seekings become more of a personal event that's triggered by the mage rather than the avatar. And this gets into some of the differences between how avatars are viewed from edition to edition, which is something that even people that agree that the game says one thing or another kind of disagree. What is an avatar? That's probably another episode that we could have a whole discussion on. So for second edition, your seeking usually starts with a meditation of some form. It takes place in some space that is undetermined. It's an inner space maybe, or you're going into the Umbra. It's unclear where the seeking is occurring. The form of that seeking is heavily influenced by your paradigm, more so than your essence. So because of that, and I think in 2E, essence kind of goes away a little bit. And the avatar is involved and may generate helpful or spiteful participants in the morality play that is going on around you. So they are still there directing things in one form or another. And the character may be struck with some disability to force them to overcome that. Some sort of obstacle is placed in front of them that they've got to surmount. And you get your epiphany from succeeding at your seeking. The interesting thing is in second edition, it indicates that seekings can be ignored for external adventures. You can just be like, nah, I'm not going to do that. I'm just going to go out and do all these other things that have nothing to do with my personal enlightenment. And from a Buddhist standpoint, maybe I guess I get that, but it's certainly an interesting choice from a mage perspective. So seekings are interesting because many of the examples given could easily be done in the game itself. So they can become like a segment of the story itself. One of the examples is an urban verbena who has to live without modern conveniences for some period of time. And I can easily see that, where someone has to go out and be an ascetic for a period of time out in the wilderness. And it's something that can easily be built into the role play elements of the story.
Yeah, which I thought was interesting, because it's like, your avatar will bring you into this realm of imagination where you have to do without modern conveniences. And you're like, why don't you just have them do without modern conveniences? Because, like, if you're doing the story where, like, we have to break into the dude's house, and be like, Sarah, do you have your infrared scope? Like, nope, avatar said I couldn't use it. Okay, it's going to be one of those nights. Got it.
Which I can totally see that. And that, as a storyteller, allows you to throw little bugs into the story that then your players have to overcome those. And that's how experience is built in the real world in some ways. And that makes sense from an enlightenment of magic standpoint as well.
Yeah. My personal advancement largely comes from enigmatic figures that tell me that I need to achieve things in the world while not using certain resources. In Revised, we go through another sea change. In 1E, the avatar was a shard of the One, was this omnipresent, omnipotent, seemingly, bit of soul stuff. In 2E, it became much more personal, and in Revised, it's like, we're going to pull back the curtain, and the avatar isn't really anything. It's this thing that lets you do magic, and to communicate with you, it claws through your memories and tries to figure out what the easiest way to talk to you is, but it really doesn't have any intelligence. And some people are like, it destroys what the avatar is. But then you look through, like, the Book of Shadows, where it has 7 points of view on the avatar, and you can't reconcile them. The only way it works is if it's this kind of weird generic thing that becomes what you need it to be. And Revised is just like, yeah, you realize the only way to actually make this work is to have it be this remarkably generic thing that is just trying to acquiesce to whatever mage it's stuck to. I like that. I think that's cool. But that's me, although my previous love of Revised is slowly reversing, because now that we're doing book reviews of Revised had longer books in general, and we haven't changed the rate at which we read them. Also, it had many fewer pictures. And it's amazing how fast a chapter can go when Rich Thomas is your art director, and like every other page is a full page spread. You're like, wow, I read so fast. You're like, no, Terry, there were 9 words in that chapter, and there were 7 Leaf Jones illustrations.
Right.
One of the changes in Revised was the seeking became an opportunity to fix personal flaws. In 1E, it was about power. In 2E, it was about deepening understanding of self. In 3E, it was more working on yourself, for lack of a better term. This is something that came across at the end of 2E in Masters of the Art, where they're like, not only must players gain wisdom during seekings, but also they should probably stop smoking and call their parents more. And you're like, wow, that's a little on the nose, Masters of the Art. See our Masters of the Art episode for that weird little aside that I thought was a weird little aside. And then they mention it 6 more times in the book. Revised really added breadth to the notion of what an avatar was, and opened up the notion of what a seeking could be. And this kind of made it as a opportunity for the player to say, here are the 5 or 6 flaws or what have you that I have baked into my character, and this is how I would like to possibly address them. The seeking lost a little bit of its mystery in this case, I guess you could say, since the avatar is now a reflection of the mage rather than the avatar being some communion with some cosmic overmind. It becomes a little bit more individualized, and the Bitter Road in Revised talks about this in a bit, which will come up later. But again, just like the way Revised opened up the notion of the avatar, it opened up the notion of what a seeking could be, or what it could really look like.
About Revised, I think that's interesting in that Revised is where I got started in Mage, and I think has influenced a lot of my perception of the avatar and seekings in general. Being a more individualized, your avatar is kind of an essence of yourself, not necessarily something external to you. There's a thing there that I think could get broken off into a whole conversation. But
yeah, the avatar starts functioning more as a metaphysical mirror than as a saint or a bodhisattva guiding you towards enlightenment. It's really just telling you who you are. And the seeking is reminding you of that and giving you an opportunity to fix it. And like, that's not nearly as interesting. I'm like, no, that's vastly more interesting. And my therapist gets $100 an hour to do the same thing.
Right, exactly.
If at the other end of it, I could also get a dot of Arete, that would be great, especially if I could also pay for it with my HSA.
Right. Give me that actualization and some mechanical benefit, and I'd be all over
exactly. Done. If I could get that and a dot in forces, that would be super, by the way. So what were Seekings like in M20?
Yeah, in M20 things change again. So M20 kind of is a toolbox of previous editions, but M20 is also of the 20th anniversary editions, a bit of a director's cut of the
Oh, I like
previous
that as a
editions
phrase.
well. Yeah. I think it's a good way of describing it, because there are things that you can see that Satiros wanted to just change because it fit his grand vision of Mage a little bit more. In this edition, Seekings kind of come out of nowhere. They seem to just be like sparks or moments that occur that are Avatar instigated. They're kind of jump started by the Avatar itself. The Mage often will go to sleep and they don't wake up until they're done with the seeking. And it takes place in either like a dreamscape or their imagination or some sort of internal space that they're fighting with or working their way through, which leads to an interesting questions of how do you tell the difference between that and a dream, or that and just any sort of random like brain firings that are going on that may be externally imposed by spirits or some sort of thing. Can other mages enter the mindscape during that seeking? In most of the seekings I've run, I've had other mages be present inside that like space, because I hate players sitting around and being bored.
Mm-hmm.
So there's got to be a way to like integrate people into those events that are happening. Either you make them play NPCs in the story, or you have them be there presently in one form or another.
Yeah, that could really go the wrong way if someone's like, is that person okay? They're like, no, they're just having a seeking, and it turns out they had like a stroke or something like that. Or like an epileptic fit. They're like, oh, they're on the verge of great enlightenment. They're like, no, I think he just needs to have a lower salt diet and get his meds under control or something like that. There's some weird side effects of like, you go to bed and you don't wake up until you're enlightened again. Like they talk about mindscapes lasting for months and so on. I'm like, what do they eat then? How does that work?
Is it a month in their brain?
Yeah.
Like not in real life. It's like seconds in real life, but in the mindscape they're there for ages. It's unclear, and I need some clarity.
A little bit. I've always done that where the character is minimally responsive. Like if you put a sandwich in their hand, they'll eat the sandwich, and that's about it. And that's how I get around the very uncomfortable questions to me that occur. Because at the same time, if you take the like, it was all in your head, like, well, no, the book gives us examples of people who have been in quiet, or the hermetic version of that, twilight, for like years.
Right.
Like these are moments of great learning. Like, I don't know.
Quiet is different than seekings, and maybe we'll talk about that. But that's the two get correlated a lot, and I think they're really have to be distinct sort of things. So it's an intriguing question. One of the things that M20 does introduce is the idea that a seeking is just like a note potentially, where the storyteller tells you what happened, where like the storyteller kind of pulls you aside and is like, hey, this thing occurs. And you like, if you want to spend your experience point on a point of Arete, you can do so at this moment, which I don't love doing, but I've done with seekings before, because sometimes I'm just like, look, too much is going on in this story, but I want you to level up and buy your Arete, and we're just going to say a thing happened and you are more enlightened now, which is not great like storytelling, but for the like greater story that you're telling, sometimes it requires that sort of like hand waving.
Yeah, one of the things they introduce in M20 is the idea, or reiterate, is that a seeking can occur in a moment of crisis. And I do kind of like the idea that you and the player already did the seeking ahead of time. The character has the XP, and like in the middle of combat or something like that, that epiphany occurs. You have your flashback to whatever your side scene was explaining what happened, and when the character returns, like their eye color changed suddenly they have an additional point of Arete, and like that's Mage to me sometimes. Where it's like, this doesn't make sense, but does it not make sense in the right way? Kind of like the tagline for A Softer World was making you feel the right kind of sad.
Which makes sense. That's a very like metaphysical sort of thing that fits Mage super, super well. It reminds me of the milestone system in Star Trek Adventures, not to go off Mage too far, but the milestone system allows you to call back to a previous episode and say, I had this character development in this moment, and now I am putting that into effect in the future.
Oh, neat.
Similar sort of thing.
So that's how seekings have occurred across editions. One of the overwhelming things seems to be that your seeking is tied to whatever your approach is to avatars. And this can be something that is informed by the player belief. Usually it is informed by essence, but it can, if you want it to be, it can be an overarching commonality among all mages. The trick to remember, though, is all mages undergo seekings. So your theory of what a seeking is and how it works needs to apply to technocrats, marauders, Nefandi, traditionalists, orphans, crafts mages. So if you pick something broad, like it is a journey of self-improvement, what is the journey of self-improvement for a marauder like? Like if you have this universal idea of getting rid of flaws because you're like merging with the overmind, what does that mean for a Nefandus? Or like, what does that mean for a technocrat? And that's one of the cases where the revised definition, for me, the wheels kind of come off, unless you make that strictly a player thing. If it's about enlightenment, then it can occur to anyone. But then it also suggests that the avatar ultimately understands the true nature of reality, because if you're an orphan and you don't have any formalized magic training, but there is this bit inside of you that still has the ability to get you to ascend, that suggests that the avatar has within it all the wisdom of the understanding of the cosmos needed to ascend, depending on what your notion of ascension is. Another interpretation is that the seeking is just recapitulating what you already know. Your character has internalized the wisdom already, and this is that moment made manifest, in the same way that at a piano recital, you know how to play the song before you step up to the piano, hopefully. But the recital is the capstone. It is the point at which you show the world, or you have a singular event that says, before the recital, the world did not know about the person who could play this particular piece, and afterwards they do. And that can essentially be what a seeking is, where the avatar has realized that the character knows it, but the character themselves now needs to realize it. And I think the other key thing to me is there is a notion that we need to keep the character and the player separate for this. One of the things that always got me about seekings is the character needs to come away with some sort of wisdom. I'm a storyteller. I don't know what the wisdom is going to look like for the character. The player tells me what that bit of wisdom or what that change is, and then we choose how we want to get from the character not knowing that to the character knowing it, and whatever the player or the storyteller involvement is. Like, that's part of the reason why failing a seeking was always weird to me. Like, I fully understand that there are storytellers and players that want to go in that direction, but to me that is almost always a player choice as opposed to a character choice. But I guess at this stage, the biggest goal is coherency, that everyone kind of know what the goal of a seeking is, that it makes sense with essence if that is something you use, with your notion of the avatar if that's something you use, as well as how you see the entirety of the awakened world. The Book of Shadows presents the idea that characters get a compulsion or a drive as they approach a certain amount of XP, and I think that that's an interesting way of running it, but that also indicates that the avatars are kind of something that drive mages as opposed to just one of the many parts of a mage's personality. The other consideration is you're only going to have to do a handful of them per player, so it's not something where it's either a one-shot or something you have to be able to do an arbitrary number of times. So something that is a sequence or a closed arc is something you get to do. And I guess with that, let's talk through a few types of seekings or some outlines or archetypes that they've taken. We've only received a handful of seeking examples throughout Mage continuity. We get one in Book of Shadows, we get one in The Bitter Road, we get a excerpt of one from M20, we get a little bit in Masters of the Art, we get a little bit more in Initiates of the Art, but that's mostly tied to the awakening as opposed to the seeking itself, although the two can often be similar. And I would like to hear about the ever-increasing challenge.
So with the ever-increasing challenge, the character must do more or less the same thing during each seeking. So the seeking is going to be something that they're going to repeat in some form or another every time they go through their thing. And either the nature of that changes slightly, or whatever the thing becomes progressively harder. I picture this as like a mountain climbing exercise where someone is climbing up one segment of the mountain, they take a break, they climb up the next segment of the mountain, they take a break. And while they're taking those breaks, they go and save the world. But the metaphor still stands as like an enlightenment progression. A character often will feel bound by an error they feel they made in a past life, maybe where they destroyed a town. So like there are this could tie to like avatars becoming reattached to mages, that they're connected to this past life that they've got, which could be during like an age of conquest, could be a colonialism kind of thing, or expansion to the American West, or during the Crusades, or whatever sort of connection they have. It's some sort of challenge they might have faced previously that continues to kind of plague them. So in this sort of setup, you will potentially have like this basic sense of awareness or understanding of something that starts out with a concept that you're following. So you might believe my expansion of knowledge requires fireballing this group of people. And that's sort of the initial spark, as it were, of the progression. And as you're going through learning more and more, you might actually realize, no, I shouldn't be destroying this challenge that is in front of me. I need to face it and maybe interact with it, negotiate through it in a different way, and find some other way of succeeding at this task, which can show just an enlightenment of understanding throughout the process. That can change based on, it should be different based on the mage and what sort of things that they find or they are challenges they are trying to overcome in the actual game space as well.
Yeah, I had a character that all of their seekings were of the form of first contact that their group had with Portuguese slavers. So each time it was the same initial visitation. In the first, they were able to simply destroy the ships on the horizon. But in subsequent cases, there were other forces that prevented that from happening. Either the mage wasn't quite potent or the ships were resilient against magical attack. So in the second one, they had to get their community to build physical barriers to prevent them from landing and bide enough time for a storm to destroy the fleet. And eventually, in later things, they do make landfall in some way, shape, or form, and now they have to go through the negotiations. And the idea was at the apex of that, they would basically have to like go out to the ocean and like dismantle the Columbian Exchange, which I think is suitable for Ascension. But every time it was the exact same thing. The characters were the same. The figures in their community that they could call upon were the same. It's just, it got more and more difficult as the Arete increased. And as Josh said, the mountain climb, where each time it gets steeper, or there are fewer handholds, or the ledges have other climbers on them, or are guarded by a rock or a griffin or what have you, is another one that's popped up.
Which makes a lot of sense. There's a Stargate episode. I've been watching a lot of Stargate, so I'll reference this, where the SG-1 team gets pulled into the memories of this whole group of this whole society. They are all in these shared memories with each other, and they have to relive the moment where they're like, I wish I could have done something different at this time. And I think that's a really similar example to this. They're constantly revisiting that concept and just trying to figure out a different way to overcome it.
Yeah, there's an episode of Legion that does something similar where one character is trying to figure out another one's motivation and winds up living through their life a dozen times, and each time gains kind of a new aspect on things, which kind of segues into, I think, what is probably the most common template of the recurring chamber sequence, which is the best name I could come up with. In one edition of the book, this is listed as being primarily a hermetic thing. In another, it is listed as being something that all mages encounter. So at least it's an established idea. But the idea is that there is some sort of narrative that unfolds across a connected set of activities, often physically in the same space. It could be chambers in a larger structure. It could be segments of a cavern. It could be part of a mountain climb or what have you. The example I have used is you have an adventure character that every time maybe this is a Society of Ether adventurer or hermetic that tends to go around and find things. I prefer not to tie things to traditions, even if I'm tying it to a paradigm, but a kind of a get out and go, magic is out there and we need to find it kind of person. That the first room was that the character had recurring dreams of being in an old family estate, and there is a ringing coming from a telephone they can't find. And on awakening, they find it in a room that previously didn't exist. And I think many of us have had the dream of, oh, there's an extra room in my house. How about that? And this is one of those where this antique telephone that maybe they recall their grandparents or great grandparents having or something like that goes off and they're finally able to answer it. And when they do, someone gives them instructions on a place they need to go. Now, in subsequent seekings, the phone gets quieter and becomes harder to find. There's more noise metaphysically in the character's life as they're drawn to do things with their tradition or with their cabal or what have you. So they may miss the ringing sometime or may not be able to find it before the ringing stops. Once they pick up the phone, though, the seeking begins. The second thing they have to do is they receive a cryptic set of directions to a place that they need to find. And over subsequent seekings, the voice either gets quieter or harder to understand, or the message or location gets cryptic. The character needs to arrange transportation to it. And each time they do a seeking, the means of transit are more and more primitive or antiquated, where the first time they're able to take a jet directly to the location in question using thoroughly modern technology, where in this case, where they're going for Arete 6, they need to take a set of prop planes across the world to get from wherever they are, maybe to like the deserts of Jordan or something like that. They need to find the location once they get there, and that's more or less the third room to things. Once they find the cave among shifting sand dunes or in dense rainforest, the terrain changes each time to challenge their survival abilities. There is a guardian of some sort that needs to be beaten, negotiated with, or tricked. You suspect the guardian represents the shifting nature of the character's interpretation of the past, as early on the guardian could just be overpowered. You could raid the tomb. You could steal the thing. You could beat up the guard at the museum or what have you. And at some point, the Guardian is going to ask to make some sort of real-world change. And that is the point where the seeking becomes literal again. The next are rooms that are tied to various adventuring skills. Maybe there's a long descent testing dexterity going down a slippery slope into the mouth of the cave or what have you. There's a social challenge that needs to be navigated, such as picking up a contact during a museum soiree. And the seeking is over when the character finds the artifact. And in this case, artifact is a capital A. And the object they are seeking changes along with what the character's wants have changed. Early on, it was a gem-encrusted chalice, or maybe it was a golden dagger, something that was obviously old and expensive and not yours. But on subsequent seekings, the artifact has become simpler. Maybe it becomes just a simple jade box, or a Mesoamerican death mask, or something like that, and represents kind of the older and more inscrutable aspects of the past. Maybe eventually the character needs to steal something like the Venus of Wellendorf, or early bone carvings where humanity first tracked the movement of the moon. But each of these, the rooms have more or less stayed constant, as it were, but their nature and presentation can change. But each time the same steps are there and they are added to. The trick with something like this, with the ever-increasing challenge, each time it's going to take about the same amount of time, but with their recurring chamber sequence, like, theoretically it's going to get longer every time, and some people may like that and some people may not. Like, the whole point is that it is a reminder of what has come before and how that needs to change, but to come up with a sequence where you're going to go through that first room like somewhere between 7 and 9 times. So, like, suddenly as a storyteller, you need to come up with 7 to 9 variants of it. And I think that's a lot to ask. I like picking things that are easy to have recurring, where it's just like cosmetic changes and that doesn't break anything.
Yeah, it makes sense. There's a good example of this sort of seeking in the book Ender's Game, which I recommend people find a used copy of rather than buying new for issues related to the author. But, you know, buy the book for the Giants game that Ender plays, and he works his way through it, but he has to do all of the same things every single time. But because it's a video game, you sort of know, oh, I have to do these things to overcome these challenges. In that book, it's a psychological game that's actually like an analysis of your personality, and it builds off of what sort of things you want and the actions that you take to give you different challenges. I see something very similar to this style of seeking with that transition in that story. So the chaining event, the previous methods we've talked about have mentioned that kind of have this element of getting longer each time that you go through them because you're progressing along a path. So that sort of makes sense that they're going to be longer and a little bit more aggressive or a little bit more difficult as you're going through, which makes sense from that sense of increasing enlightenment. The Bitter Road gives an example of of characters who each have a seeking in a glade where they're approached by their avatar to do something specific. And at some point, the avatar thought they were getting complacent, so the character waits and waits and nothing happens. The avatar wanted the mage to start looking around, which they didn't do. So it seems like the character probably failed that seeking by not taking action.
Yeah, it's kind of funny. They eventually wander off and they encounter a sleeping dragon, and then they encounter their avatar, and they're like, "What's that?" They're like, "That's what your seeking was going to be, but it got bored."
You took too long.
Yeah. So,
which is fantastic. Kind of an interesting thing to have happen. Like you didn't take up the challenge, so you have failed the seeking. I don't know if I love that, but it is a thing you could do. So in this sort of situation, the character could be at a historical event from different points of view, and they've got to do something different in each of those points of view. You've got to take different actions and see different elements of that story or that thing that is occurring, that moment in time. I think there's a good example. Maybe the character is repeatedly present at the shooting of Archduke Franz Ferdinand. I think this is fantastic as a moment that has both real world kind of repercussions and is an interesting, what if you were in different places and could do different things here? What actions would you take? What choices would you enact to change the outcome of this? Maybe you can't actually change anything, but you start off as Gavrilo Princip, who was the shooter, and then then become the Duchess of Hohenberg. You're just a child in the crowd looking for their dog, a passerby that thinks this whole thing is ridiculous. Whatever, you are some figure in this story one way or another. Ultimately, you're responsible. In the end, you realize that every figure in this story is responsible for the death of the Archduke. And it's an effort by your avatar to show the interconnectedness of everything in the world. I think that's a good example of something that you could do with this sort of seeking.
I think it'd be funny if literally all seekings that all mages had revolved around the shooting of Archduke Franz Ferdinand. And eventually it happens, and all the mages who've for thousands of years have had this as their seeking are like, oh.
This is the moment we should have been paying attention.
Exactly. And not because it's the most important moment in history by any stretch of the imagination, but just because the universe is weird sometimes. And no matter what you do, every seeking takes place in 1972 on the set of the waning days of Joni Loves Chachi or something like that, and every seeking involves that. You're like, this is particularly weird. Or everyone's on the set of a Bollywood film being produced or something like that.
I love that as just a world building element to have mages maybe not ever talk about their seekings either, and then suddenly a couple of mages are like, yeah, I had this seeking.
They start comparing notes.
What the hell is going on here? Before doing this, make sure you have an idea of what your avatars are, so it all makes sense.
And then kind of the last general type I had was the metaphysical journey. This is the notion of the seeking as the avatar revealing something novel. The trick is, for instance, one of the recurring themes is the idea that technocratic seekings are going to be a string of breakthroughs. The problem with that is, how do you get the character to define a new law of reality that their character is going to discover? If your character is going to figure out a new law of physics or something like that, that's a lot of work to figure that out, narratively, and then to come up with 10 of those is a bit much. So in this case, the seeking is simply the avatar revealing something. There is wisdom or knowledge, gnosis or Sophia, if you want to choose other magical terms, as it were, where it's literally an epiphany. The character suddenly realizes something about the nature of reality that is untied maybe to previous studying that they have done. And that is just wisdom or learning that your avatar hands to you. This could be a progression through the spheres, and maybe your character either needs to prove competence or innovation with the magic they're doing, and at the end of it they get insight into a metaphysical principle or an idea. Again, this can be narratively interesting and gives an opportunity to convey the idea that insight can be handed down. Characters can still have varying ideas, where if this happens in a dream, someone could say, hey, this idea came to me in a dream or something, or while I was dozing off in the lab or something like that. But metaphysically, it is the avatar just handing you a bit of things. Are there any other like frameworks you have seen for seekings? All of them seem to break down kind of into something like this for me.
Yeah, I think this is a good basic framework for most of the type of seekings that you would see. The only other one I can see is the story as seeking. Like
Okay.
the whole
Yeah.
game event is actually a seeking that you are progressing on. And as you're going through it, you're just having these moments that are like, boop, here's an epiphany. And your Arete increases. I think that is a decent way of integrating it into your overall story. I think it takes something away from what Mage does and saying that enlightenment is personal on some level. But I also can see some value to just saying, hey, this quest that you are on is a seeking for all of you as a group. And therefore you are, getting something from it.
And there are two ways to take that the something you are all on. Either you can have the characters be themselves in someone else's seeking, or they take on some sort of psychological mantle that the character undergoing a seeking's avatar has chosen to be like, oh, I'm going to have this cabal mate or this chantry mate be in there, and that person gets to role play it. So like we have the notion of what is the narrative. The question is also the storyteller mechanics to it. And you had mentioned before that you like having characters involved in each other's seekings. What form does that take? Are they literal? Are they manifest? Are they just figments of imagination? What do you do in your games?
I've used all of the above. Generally, I try to have them be literally involved in one form or another, but sometimes it just doesn't work for the character's paradigm. I had a pseudo orphan, pseudo dream speaker player who their character went into the Umbra on a journey. And in the seeking, the rest of the characters accompanied them on the journey into the Umbra and did the thing. And they sort of stayed to the side most of the time and let the character that was on their seeking make the choices, but they would talk through them and give her suggestions so that she could then go, oh, I think this is the right path based on the advice my friends are giving me and the other input that I have from all of these other sources. But I have also done the whole, you are just playing different elements of the mage themselves. You're playing different parts of their personality in this moment. And these are just reflections of your friends as your personality.
I do like the thing that you kind of alluded to earlier, though, that if Mage undergoing seeking and Mage undergoing quiet are in the same class of phenomena, even if they are resolved very differently, the idea that with Mind 3, someone could join you on a seeking and kind of witness it, that would be kind of a level of metaphysical intimacy that I think would be fascinating. I think that would be great justification for two characters with otherwise different paradigms to, from thenceforth, be able to assist each other with magical effects. I got to root around in your metaphysical underwear drawer, so I kind of have a better idea of how these things roll. For me, I hate seekings. Like, I probably should have put my cards on the table sooner before doing this episode. But so the groups I am in, we are very time constrained. We get together roughly once a month. So I am always looking for ways to expedite or change the notion of the seeking. The most common one I do is the Blue Book, where the character tells me how their seeking went. The character can choose to succeed or fail. If they fail, they usually have something that they get to work on. As a side effect of that, the character may choose to narratively fail to showcase a character's hubris, to kind of change the direction of character development. If like they had an arrogant asshole, a failed seeking can really put you in your place pretty quickly, can make you come correct, as it were, at least in the avatar sense. And they just tell me how it goes. I say, give me a plot hook that I get out the other end. Tell me what your character learned. The players can then choose to use this almost as Deus Ex to get metaphysical information they didn't have access to before. Like, hey, I found my lost mentor, by the way. Or at least I have a lead. Great. That's something I can play with as a storyteller. I can now weave that in. One of the recurring themes of my game is I never have fewer than 3 plot threads going at the same time. So anytime I get something extra to work with, I certainly appreciate that. The other one is the avatar quest, where your avatar literally tells you to do a thing. This involves the avatars being animate or at least able to in some way communicate with the mage they're attached to. I like this because it kind of suggests a weird otherness to avatars that I like. I like the idea that a mage and an avatar might have slightly different agendas or might have slightly different goals. Mage in conflict with avatar has been listed as a complication for magic, I think since at least revised, where it could make things between a +1 and a +3, which suggests that like it's not just a reflective soul lump of some sort, that it does have wants and desires, and it will be like, hey, you need to do this for me. And that there may be avatar lineages, that a given avatar may be tied to a few others, and they may have intents of some sort. Like we get the idea that certainly that there is some shared characteristic among all Nephandic avatars. They've all been inverted by the call, and it doesn't seem unreasonable to me that a member of the Akashiana or the Euthanatoi could be very familiar with their avatar lineage and be like, oh, it came through in these incarnations, it dealt with these other things. These two avatars seemingly have been at war for 600 years, which is why the Himalaya War took so long to resolve. And that maybe the avatar is almost using it as positive reinforcement, like do this thing for me and I'll give you access to greater power, at which point a seeking then becomes about power and not necessarily wisdom. Like when your avatar is like, to get your 7th dot, you need to kill this guy. You're like, why? You're like, because he killed me in a past life. But it's in a 14-year-old girl now. Why are we doing this? That could take you to some places that also fit, to me, very well in Mage, but also fundamentally change the notion of what a seeking is.
I think that's fascinating. And I think it's really, it showcases the fact that Mage is a game that you're going to have to craft around your characters that are in the story and find out what they view their avatar as, because in a lot of ways various cultures around the world have different views of how magic works in reality. That's a similar sort of thing that you can just say the avatar is different or is expressed differently for all of these different individuals. I think it adds a lot.
If you were looking for some examples of that, as we mentioned, the Bitter Road has one, the Book of Shadows has one. I found the Dusk Wiki online. I don't know if you're familiar with Dusk. It is a seemingly large-ish but well-documented multi-line World of Darkness game, and they document everything. They have a lot of storytellers. They have a pretty expansive wiki. The wiki is sufficiently expansive that sometimes I will find things there that I'm like, I don't know if this is actually in a book, but I like it. But I do a podcast called Mage the Podcast, so I should probably find the book it's in and before I reference it. And they had some pretty intense rules for like seekings. Like one of the things they're like, oh, before you can go for 4, you need to have at least a willpower of 6. You need to have knowledge of 6 spheres. You need to have an awareness rating of 2. And that's a way to do it, to have this procedural setup if you want. I think the other good resource to call upon is Satiros Filbricato in Mage Made Easy. Makes mention of a whole bunch of questions for seekings. Like, what are 5 internal questions that your character has about the nature of the world? What are 5 unresolved issues that your character has? What are 5 regrets or guilty things? What are the 5 favorite foods of your character? And it is just a list of questions that you can ask to help do that. I would read through the list, but at that point, I am just copying another author's work in a way that I'm not entirely comfortable with. So I'll include a link to that in the show notes, but that is a very good checklist, or at least framework for figuring out what are the elements that should appear in a seeking. And that is going to apply to almost all seeking types. Like, so even if the seeking is an avatar quest where it is something that is out there in the world, it still makes sense to have callbacks or even slight mystical elements or magical appearances, like the same people you see regardless, or the same recurring color pattern or motif or something like that. Or you see something like the yellow sign from the King in Yellow or something, this recurring visual element, maybe that only your character can see, that is kind of the reminder that they're on this adventure or on this journey.
Yeah, I love all of that. I love, this is going to sound really geeky or nerdy, I think appropriate, but I love survey questions. And I often will create survey questions for my games ahead of time. And I think having a list of like questions like, what are these things that are about your personality and metaphysically related to you that I can pull on later on into a story? I think that's always a good idea. So definitely support that. So I will say that seekings are hard. Don't expect to get them right the first few times you run them. It will always be hard. regardless. That's been my experience with them at least.
And my statement is seekings are optional. The game does not fall apart without them. There should be some milestone of wisdom. It is also not unreasonable that your characters won't necessarily increase their arete. I mean, that just happens. More and more games are one-shots or short arcs or something like that. So if a seeking never comes up in your game, that's fine. Or alternatively, that is a good way to bookend an arc. Where if you're like, okay, we all want to try Mage, we'll kick the tires on this. To make things faster, everyone starts with an Arete of 4 or 5 or something like that. And this Chronicle is going to end to make sure we have the Chronicle adventure where you stop the baddie or allow the good thing to happen or help the dragon egg hatch or whatever, or destroy the Nephandic Labyrinth. But to add a personal note to the end of it, each of you is going to get to go through a small seeking or something, and that gets to be your capstone. And it's something beautiful and personal that, like, the other game lines generally don't have. Like, the closest I know of is Wraith.
I think Werewolf has some similar things when you talk about quests.
Okay.
But quests are really pack-oriented, so they're still a little bit different, but within that framework.
Oh, interesting. Do you think that would be interesting if all the characters had in some way related avatars? That, like, the thing that brought your group together and could be great, just like the I don't know if you ever read the Time of Judgment book on Mage. It involves a technocrat, a traditionalist, and a Wu Kang member kind of being fundamentally tied in some way that doesn't become obvious. How does it work in Werewolf? Now I'm super curious on what those pack quests, for lack of a better term, look like.
Well, often a quest in Werewolf is there's a specific goal for it. Like the pack is going to do something that is its own, like, contained story, but they're trying to get something out of it. Often a gift or a fetish or some sort of artifact that they need to retrieve from the Umbra or from another location. So it's similar to a seeking in that you're trying to get something mechanically from it, but you have to go through this storyline quest to acquire it. And oftentimes it's for one character in the group to get this one particular gift, or maybe the whole group. But if you have to go and seek out, I have the Ice Heart totem, then you would have to go into the legendary realm, seek out the ultimate winter, and find the totem in its home and get it to give you that gift. That's one example of that type of quest that you can do in Werewolf that I think is similar to Seekings.
And I think in Mage, I have no problem with the Middle Umbra, but that's the Werewolf playground. So I'm entirely fine with modifying that and being like, oh no, in the High Umbra, you need to get to the Epiphany that will represent Arete 6, which involves you doing this thing that involves going up a spire. Or alternatively, if you're like me and you prefer the Low Umbra because wraiths are fundamentally understandable in a way that Aelita, Lady of Feathers, is not, or a Celestian is just incomprehensible and out there, then doing the same thing and having to descend somewhere into the underworld to find a piece of lost wisdom or understanding, I think is also perfectly legit. So that's a thing that happens out in the world as opposed to, like, inside the werewolf, though.
Right.
Yeah. Neat. We had a few listener questions. Again, whenever we do one of these, I try and post a new Discord channel, and if you add a little question mark, we'll try and get to the question. I think we addressed a bunch of them in the process here, but here are a few that I wanted to bang on specifically. If you're interested in what other listeners have done, go to discord.me/matesthepodcast and see the commentary we have there. We have some very insightful posters who've done a lot of interesting things. And so the first question was, what should low-level seekings be like compared to high-level seekings? In this case, one of the commenters brought up the fact that a lot of people just start the game with Arete 3 because seekings are hard and Arete costs a lot of experience, so why wouldn't you spend the 4 freebie points at creation to do that? And to me, low-level seekings are different from high-level seekings in one of two completely contradictory ways, depending on kind of the framework that you want to do. In one sense, they are generally personal. They are about your mage coming to terms with the fact that they are a mage. So it is some sort of active discovery. It is realizing that maybe there is a use for your magic that you have never seen before. That second, you have the first quote unquote seeking in the form of an awakening, where you gain your first dot and suddenly you become metaphysically aware. You get access to all the 1 dot abilities. With Arete 2, you suddenly have the ability to influence chance, to heal yourself, to do basic transmutations, to modify forces or whatever, depending on what sphere, to create a new quintessence flow and possibly deal aggravated damage, depending on what edition you're using and whether or not you allow force lightsabers to exist. Yeah, you gain the ability to do very basic correspondence effects. You are now an agent, a true agent of change in the universe that has the ability to directly tug on the magical strings of the cosmos. Even at a light level, it is beyond what most mortals will ever be able to do. Yeah, except for certain low-level effects and certain pattern spheres, maybe. So that seeking should focus on that, to me, that you are now this agent of change, that you've gone from observing the magical world and becoming aware of it to someone who has the ability to influence it. And to me, that seeking should do that. So maybe they come across a problem that is only solvable with magic, only with forces 2, using that to directly turn fire into gravity, or something like that, or summoning lightning, a simple statoelectric discharge. Are they able to circumvent some sort of barrier or boundary that they haven't been able to deal with before? Now, later ones can focus on the hubris of using that to excess or what have you. So you have the idea that it should be a personal journey, that you're coming to terms with magic, and that you have this new way of dealing with the world. The other option is they should show the world as being bigger. At low levels, your avatar knows more about magic than you do. Like, even if the avatar is just like all the crumbs that have fallen off the plates of the mages before, until you've gained some power, the avatar is going to have its intuitive understanding of magic is going to be stronger than your formal understanding of magic. So to me, it is a really strong chance to establish what the avatar is, what your relationship with it is, and how your mage is going to go from someone who is driven by their avatar to someone who maybe is a stronger partner in that avatar mage relationship. Maybe you get a glimpse of an artifact of ancient power, or the goings-on of a group that you don't know about, or a horizon realm that has been lost. This, interestingly, at least to me, makes low-level mage seekings a source of information for older mages, that you get a glimpse of insight or a sudden burst of power that is tied to a seeking that you don't have otherwise. And as you progress, the mage loses access to that potent and maybe intuitive aspect of their avatar. So maybe your superiors or maybe other members of your cabal are very interested in what happens at Arete 2 and 3 as you briefly gain access to a much larger world that, as you lose intuitive access to, as you gain formal access to. So those are two ways to me that you can make a low-level seeking fundamentally different and important. And to me, also being low-level, they should be really hard to mess up. It should be one of those things where it's like, you have to make it to the finish line, and your character could like lie down and just roll there, and gravity will take them there. like the idea of like, yeah, you want to actually do something cool in the game? Well, that's going to be really, really hard. I just think that's mean.
Right. That was going to be my point. Something similar to that is, I think low-level seeking should be easy, and not necessarily easy for the player. The player should probably have to like boggle their mind a little bit, but the ultimate outcome or solution should be like, oh, duh. It should be a fairly obvious like epiphany. And then from there, like that gives mages hubris, thinking, oh, this is all easy. I've already got this. When they get up to that like 4th or 5th dot, then it's like, oh, maybe I don't know everything that I think I know. And those middle levels should be really like a struggle of analyzing oneself. So I think that like low level should be easy to build on hubris, and then you have that like twisted like sense of, am I actually succeeding, when you get to those mid levels. And the higher levels should be again a bit like, I do know this as well as I think I do. Maybe this is just my anxiety speaking, but I think it's a good way of building on oneself.
Oh, that's interesting. Like the curve of confidence, as it were. This is easy. This is hard. No, this is easy again. But I recognize how hard it was. I have a friend of mine that during their commencement speech for when they were graduating college, the speaker talked about U-Haul moments, where throughout their life, the speaker had always had someone else move them, whether it be parents or a boyfriend or a service or something. But eventually, when they finally moved, or after a divorce or something, they moved themselves and they rented a U-Haul. And it was just a day of backbreaking work, a difficult drive, and then another day of backbreaking work. And the speaker realized the appropriateness of calling it U-Haul. Like,
Right.
it's all on you. And the sudden realization of what is behind what something that is otherwise obvious, that person referred to as U-Haul moments. So I like the idea that that lower level seekings are U-Haul moments, where at the end of it you're like, oh, magic. Then in retrospect it's pretty obvious, but in the moment, boy howdy, was that difficult.
Yeah. That makes sense. I like that metaphor.
When I think technocracy, I think Josh Heath. I don't know if you've actually written for either of the Technocracy Reloaded or...
I have sadly not written for either of the Technocracy books.
Okay, well, I think Josh inaccurately. But regardless, Josh, one of the good questions that we got were, what do technocratic seekings look like?
So I think technocratic seekings are, in a lot of ways, similar to tradition seekings, in that you are having moments where you recognize you have a greater understanding of things than you realize you do. You are like progressively growing on yourself, building on yourself. I like technocratic seekings being one of two things: either full on dream sequences where things don't make any sort of sense from a technocratic paradigm, and you are a crusader knight and you are going through this storyline and you're like, how does this apply to my real life? And at the end of it, maybe you realize, it was the friends we made along the way. That can be one direction you can go in. Or I like the progressive development of self in a technocratic seeking. When you're sitting down and sometimes like doing personal review of your year in an annual review process, there can be like a sense of like, oh, I've succeeded at these 10 things this year that I didn't realize. And that is that sense of accomplishment is your epiphany, is your like breakthrough into another level of Arete.
Oh, that's interesting, because like the technocrats, because they have an HR division and a personal development coach, like they don't need to have this periodic moment necessarily where the avatar is like, ding. It's like, no. Every quarter you have to take a big ass test, and the academy doesn't care that you spent most of the time murking reality deviants. They still need to make sure that you're getting your appropriate amount of personal development time in.
Yeah, which I think it fits the paradigm of the technocrat really well. And it actually does require some self-reflection, which I think is helpful to building on that sense of enlightenment. I do like your genius, like coming to you and just being like, hey, dumbass, like we got to go do this thing. I tend to, when I run technocrats, tend to have the genius appear as an outside figure. And physically, or at least in the mage's perception, physically come to them and be like, hey man, blah, blah, blah. Like it's a Beautiful Mind, I think it is, where John Nash has what amounts to be a hallucination, imaginary friend, those types of things, who ultimately helps him like through all these different things. And he realizes later on in life, this is a completely like figment of my imagination. I like having those sorts of things for my technocrats as well.
Yeah, the trick then becomes like, what are acceptable forms of genius to a technocrat? Again, Josh made mention of the Inner Night story, that a lot of technocrats draw on the early history of the Order of Reason, when it was less ambiguous about the good they were doing in the world, when it's like, we're killing dragons and bringing people the power of water purification. Yeah, sure, your seasonal rite no longer works to summon soft rains, but like, we gave you canals. You no longer have to supplicate before this verbena coven to make sure that you can have apples this year. Like we gave you that power. To me, the important part is, as we went back, as we said before, like whatever system you choose has to make sense for all of the factions, or you at least need to explain how it is different. I like the idea here that for a technocrat, their geniuses are somewhat remote. Like to me, the primordial version of a technocratic avatar, like the form their genius would take, is that call maybe into space or the other worlds, or towards a kind of mathematical purity that is utterly alienating, which is why I'm glad that we have the system of clarity/denial, which is quiet due to an excess of stasis. I like the idea that in the revised notion that it is kind of a reflection of the self, and this could result in corruption or alienation. Often to me, technocratic seekings are going to be some sort of sacrifice that gains you knowledge or understanding. There is this remoteness that is going to occur over subsequent things. The other thing that's also kind of interesting is that it is suggested that at Arete 10, that technocrats merge with the universe. that rather than ascending, they kind of do the opposite, that maybe they join whatever is at the heart of control or what have you. And I kind of like that your seekings are glimpses of that. How that manifests, again, is up to you. It could be literal. A character could periodically be called into some otherwise unknown HR office, a room 102 or room 201 or the red room or something that is kind of tied to room 101 or the white room that is out there. No one's quite sure where it is. Everyone has fuzzy memories of it, but maybe you do absolutely nonsensical tests of some sort, like you have to solve a Rubik's Cube and that is it. And the goal is to just kind of create a sense of bafflement that kind of keeps you grounded or what have you. But there needs to be space for success. Like the technocrat needs to be able to get their thing, because obviously there are technocrats with high Arete ratings, so there has to be something. And that to me is the important part. It can differ for the factions if you want it to. You get a lot of information about what those seekings are like for the Nefandi. Thanks, Book of the Fallen. And the last questions I have is, what mechanics do you use during seekings?
I try and keep my mechanics very, very low in a seeking. I want my players to be making choices that make sense for their characters and then be playing those out. Sometimes there will be like, I need to jump across a chasm or something like that. I will have them make a roll, with my goal being that they're going to succeed at the roll regardless. Like, unless they botch it. And then I'm going to have that be a fail forward moment where it seems like you were meant to botch that and it leads you to the enlightenment you are seeking one way or the other. I think it's a terrible decision to have someone fail a seeking unless the player wants them to fail the seeking for some reason or another. And I'm comfortable with having that be a thing if the player wants it, but generally I'm going to say you are going to succeed at this. It's just a way for you to show your character progressing through your awareness and your understanding.
I think mechanically the important part to me is that this be an opportunity to show how weird Mage is. This is a good opportunity to me for a character to change their demeanor, to start shifting their nature, maybe to move a dot in a sphere around, to change a focus, not just to drop them. For a character to change a paradox flaw, to suddenly manifest a new merit. This is a change where the difference between this character and what came before, to me, should be obvious. Now, mind you, if this were kind of a real phenomenon, that kind of digital change wouldn't necessarily be accurate because people don't necessarily always advance in that kind of stepwise fashion. The other thing I do is a character who is trying to solve a mystery or figure something out at least gets a certain number of clues as provided by their avatar, and that may be tied to some sort of stat. So I am fine if a seeking is hard. Again, I don't want it necessarily to be something that a character can fail. So they tend to lack rolls. I wonder if any of your characters have ever noticed that they've never failed a roll or something during a seeking or something like that, or it's always behind closed doors or what have you.
I don't know if any of the characters themselves have realized, like, oh, I always seem to succeed at this. The players seem to have some understanding.
Okay, they're like, I'm on to you, Mr. Heath. And with that, we've gone through a lot about seekings. Anything else you want to lay down for the record before we draw this to a close?
I think I already mentioned that that they're hard. I want to reiterate that this is, because it's such a personal thing, it is okay to struggle with this and seek out other guidance from other storytellers. This is a great time to be like, hey, I need some ideas from people and garner them. But don't be afraid to lean on your players and say, what do you want out of this story? And they will tell you, they will provide something. Even the most difficult player that doesn't quite grok all of these things will think of something that will help you tell that seeking for them.
And if nothing else, the player should be able to give you a metaphor for advancement that would fit within the character's paradigm and worldview. That should at least be a starting point if you're going that direction. Otherwise, you as a storyteller should kind of have an idea of what the nature of the avatar is, or would like it to be, to kind of answer that. And it's one of those cases where one may inform the other. You may have a particular notion of what you want seekings to look like, and that may inform what you think avatars should look like. So all of these things should hopefully point narratively in the same direction. They should hopefully all reinforce each other. So if you're not sure, look to what you have already established as to how magic works, or the relationship with the character's mentor, or the power of the traditions, or the universality of the magical experience. All of those will help guide you for what a seeking should look like.
Yep, absolutely. Good advice.
And with that, Josh, if people want to hear more of your lovely voice, where can they do that?
They can find me on Werewolf the Podcast, where I talk about Werewolf the Apocalypse. We are doing a retrospective analysis of the books that have come out for that game. I also do the Endcast on the Werewolf the Podcast stream, which is about Trinity Continuum and the various editions of that. And you can also find me on High Level Games, where you can find all the various books that I've worked on for the Storyteller's Vault and other things like that.
Awesome. Josh, thank you so much.
Thanks, Harry.
You've been listening to Mage the Podcast, which just wants to say your hair is on point today. This show is made possible by executive producers who include Anders S., Andrew K., Andrew E., Brendan, Bryce Perry, Christopher P., Chris Zach, Ira Grace, Jenna F., Justin B., John H., John Magnuson, Josh Goulden, Michael Parker, Richard Bat Brewster, William C., William M., and Jay Sunsarn. I should probably change the order of those at some point. Maybe. Our executive producer call out this week is to William M. While you may think M is an initial, in actuality, that's the entirety of their surname. It's like 6 or 7 M's in a row. The is a family name, and the Campbell Soup song by the 90s one-hit wonder The Crash Test Dummies was written about William's family. The stories are simply a distraction from Brad Roberts' tribute to the M family. Please note that he looks suspiciously like Javier Bardem as well. That's Brad, the lead singer of Crash Test Dummies, not William. But William may also. I've never seen William. If you'd like to become an executive producer, like William, get a chat color in Discord and have me make up things about you when you join, as well as receive our executive producer-only podcast, So What You Playing, you can now become one by clicking on Become a Supporter in the show notes or through the episode entries on our webpage. If you super liked this episode or super didn't, drop us a line at magethepodcast.com or at magethepodcast on Twitter. We read every message. We have a hop in Discord community at discord.me/magethepodcast. You can subscribe to our show on Spotify, Anchor, TuneIn, iTunes, Google Play Podcasts, or the podcatcher of your choosing. If you like us, give us a review on the platform of your choosing, or tell a friend. It super helps. Also go to magethepodcast.com for show notes and all of our previous shows. Now go change reality and register for my online convention, tryitcon.com. Also look in the show notes. Bye.